Hello, everyone. Welcome back to a brand new episode of Ball Talk with Chanel. If you're new here, hello, my name is Chanel, and every week we discuss the latest news and scores that has happened in sports. And let me tell you something, this past week has been insane. We have March Madness going on for both men's college basketball and women's college basketball. We are getting closer to the NBA playoffs, and we also got a really big boxing match this past weekend. So we are going to be talking about all of that in this episode. So before we get started, please be sure to check out the description box down below. That'll give you all of my social media accounts. This video is also available on Spotify and on Patreon. So you can go click on the links in the description box to go and sign up for Spotify, for Patreon, if you want to listen to this on other platforms. Also, too, if you did not know, I have my own newsletter called Ball Talk Breakdown. Now, this podcast will not be explaining every single thing that has happened in sports, because if that was the case, then this video and every single video would be way too long. So I came up with a whole newsletter called Ball Talk Breakdown. What that does is talks about other news and scores that has happened in sports, and also gives you my opinion on those. They're supposed to be quick, easy, to the point, and my goal with this newsletter is so that way you can finish it in 10 minutes. So think of this as like your quick read in the morning while you are drinking your coffee or your matcha. So if you want to go and subscribe to the newsletter, then please be sure to hit the link down below and put in your email, because the next issue comes out this upcoming Monday. So with all that being said, let's get started. So let's start first with March Madness, because like I said, it has been complete madness, hence the name. So we are going to start first with men's college basketball, and then we're going to move on to women's college basketball. Now, with men's college basketball, I want to start first with 4 of the Sweet 16 games that has happened and what the outcome were for those games. So let's start first with the fact that Iowa defeated Nebraska 77-71. Now, Iowa has not had the greatest season this past season, but the run that they are having in March Madness really needs to be studied. And I'm actually shocked that more people are not talking about this. No one expected Iowa, not for women's college basketball, mind you. This is for men's college basketball. No one expected for them to move on to the Elite Eight. No one really expected for them to beat a team like Nebraska, okay? So the crazy run that they're having right now is truly, truly insane. And now next, I want to talk about Purdue versus Texas, because Purdue ended up winning 79-77. Now, I have mentioned this last week, but I want to reiterate this for this episode, okay? No one expected Texas to go this far at all, okay? Texas is the same exact team that they were one of the last teams to actually be in the tournament. In fact, they had to actually participate in the first 4 in order to even get into the tournament in the first place. Now, this is the same team that advanced all the way to the Sweet 16, but on top of that, they were this close to then going and advancing to the Elite Eight. They kept it close with Purdue. It was just that Purdue ended up taking over at the very end ultimately. They took the last shot. That's what allowed them to take the lead, and that's ultimately what allowed them to win. But Texas is another team, like Iowa, that I think more people need to talk about, because no one really expected Texas to be in a Sweet 16. Everyone was really shocked that Texas beat BYU in the first round. So to see Texas, that same team that was in the first 4, advance all the way to the Sweet 16 and was this close to advancing to the Elite Eight, like, props to them, because like I said, no one really was expecting that. Now, the next game I want to talk about is Arizona versus Arkansas. Now, Arkansas has had a good season. The question is, will Arkansas be able to be competitive against Arizona? And let me tell you something. Arizona took care of business. They won by double digits. They won by like 20 points. And that to me was a little shocking, because I actually thought that this was going to be a 79-77 type of game, just like Purdue and Texas. The fact that Arizona beat Arkansas and beat them by that large of a margin is really indicative of how they will be for the rest of the tournament. Are they going to be able to keep it up for the Elite Eight game? Are they going to be able to take that energy into the Final Four if they advance, right? So it has been completely insane by Arizona to be able to take down Arkansas the way they did. And the last game that I want to talk about in this Sweet 16 section is Houston versus Illinois. Now, Houston always has a good team, right? They've had a good team for the past couple of seasons, right? And Illinois also has been having a good season as well. And let me tell you something. I thought Houston was going to win. I thought Houston would be one of those teams where they would be in the Elite Eight / Final Four. Because if it wasn't going to be Florida, I thought it was going to be Houston. And Illinois pulled off the ultimate upset. They ended up taking down Houston, and they took them down pretty handedly. I mean, Illinois ended up winning 65-55, so it's not like this was an extremely close game. I mean, Illinois had a pretty comfortable lead against Houston. So that to me was a major, major shocker. So those four teams that I just mentioned that just won those games, they are moving on to the Elite Eight. So now let's talk about the Elite Eight games. So first up, you got Illinois versus Iowa, where Illinois ended up winning 71-59. And so that honestly should not shock anybody. Like I said, Iowa is not the greatest team in the world. It's just a matter of how impressive it is that they were able to advance all the way to the Elite Eight given the team that they have right now. It's actually a little crazy. And honestly, the fact that Illinois only beat them by 12 is also really good. I know it's double digits. I know it is double digits. But my point, though, is with a team like Iowa, you would think a team like Illinois would beat them by like 20, 30 points, right? But it really was not a blowout. You can see they only won by 12. And I have to give my props to Iowa because having the run that they had is actually really, really good. And for Illinois, it is great that they are moving on to the Final Four. Now let's talk about Arizona versus Purdue because Arizona ended up winning by 15 points. They ended up winning 79-64. Now, what's actually really crazy was the fact that for the first half of the game, Purdue was actually keeping it close with Arizona. So there was the big question. I know a lot of people love Arizona, and the question was going to be, was Purdue going to be able to pull off that type of upset? And towards the end of the second half, you saw Arizona start to pull away, and ultimately Purdue was not able to make that comeback. Purdue was not able to keep up at the very end. So, look, it's not a bad loss, of course, because Arizona has such a good team, but it is really impressive that Purdue, given the team that they had, were able to advance to the Elite Eight. And then now you're going to see Arizona play in the Final Four. Now, the next game that I want to talk about is Duke versus UConn. Now, let me tell you something. This was a game that I think everyone was just sat down ready to watch yesterday, okay? Now, Duke was up by as much as 19 points. They had a very comfortable lead against UConn. So I think at that point, everyone kind of looked and was like, you know what? Duke may be winning this game. UConn looks like they are out, whatever it may be, okay? Second half, UConn locked in because UConn ended up cutting the lead then to 15. They cut it then to 11. They then cut it to 5. And then at one point, they made it a 1-point game with 2 minutes left of the game. And so you're kind of on your seat like, whoa, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Then eventually it became a 2-point game with 10 seconds left. Okay, now obviously, right, UConn is not completely out. That is plenty of time to either take it into overtime or hit a game-winning shot. Now, Duke ultimately was trying to inbound the ball. They're trying to play keep away, basically. Then you had Duke player Caden Boozer try to basically lob it over to the other side of the court from half court, and eventually it got tipped by DeMary, it looked like. Now, eventually, it got passed off to Carabin, who then passed it off to Braylon Mullins, who then pulled a 3 from the logo. Now, that shot in and of itself really did shock me. And the reason why is because UConn at that point did not necessarily need a 3. I don't know if that was more of a, you know what, let's just put it up and let's just see what happens. Or if that was a, I'm not aware of how much time there is left, and I'm thinking there's less time than how much there really is. And then let me tell you something. That shot eventually paid off because it was absolute wet like water, did not touch the rim at all, and that is how UConn ended up winning the game. They hit that 3 and left 0.3 seconds left on the clock. They left 0.3 seconds left on the clock. Then, of course, it was zero point 0.3 seconds left, right? Duke tried to inbound it and throw it to the other side, and it got deflected, and that is how UConn ended up winning the game. Now, what's really crazy is that Duke is the number one team in the country, or at least was for this past season. And ultimately, everybody's question was Duke going to be able to keep that energy up all the way through to the national championship? Now, it's no secret. I had Duke winning the whole thing, okay? That was what my bracket looked like. But then I saw how Duke played against Siena in the first round. And eventually, at that point, I thought to myself, oh, this is not going to be a pretty game at all. Okay, this is not going to be pretty. I don't know if they're going to make it to the national championship game, because that's not a team that you should be struggling against, no offense. And so with UConn having a win like that, it was just insane. I did start screaming. I really was just shocked by that shot. Okay, I think Dan Hurley was. I think the entire UConn team was shocked by that. That was honestly one of, if not the greatest shot from this year's tournament. I honestly cannot think of another shot that is like that was that type of exciting, you know? So ultimately, congratulations to UConn for taking down Duke, for pulling off that upset, and I cannot wait to see them in the Final Four. And then the last game that I want to talk about in this Elite Eight matchup is Michigan versus Tennessee. Now, Michigan showed that they are just a way better team than Tennessee. Tennessee just did not have enough to be able to keep up with Michigan. Okay, we all know that Michigan's a good team, right? Tennessee also had a pretty decent team, but I mean, the talent and everything else, like, Tennessee was just not going to be able to keep up. And ultimately, Michigan ended up blowing out Tennessee. They won by like 30 points. So, does that shock anybody? No, not really. Because, like I said before, right, Michigan just has that talented of a team where, honestly, according to my bracket, I had Duke versus Michigan in the national championship. Now, Michigan will be playing Arizona in the Final Four. So, that should be an excellent matchup. Okay, and then Illinois and UConn will be playing each other in the Final Four, which, again, excellent matchups in the Final Four. So I cannot wait for those games. So now that we've talked about men's college basketball, now let's actually move on and talk about women's college basketball. So first off, let's talk about Notre Dame versus Vanderbilt. Now, let's start off with the fact that no one really expected Notre Dame to go to the Sweet 16. Okay, Notre Dame did not have that great of a season, right? It's very reliant on Hannah Hidalgo, because if Hannah Hidalgo has a good game, then of course there is a chance that Notre Dame's winning, but if she is off, then the whole team is off. And Notre Dame versus Vanderbilt was such a great game, okay? You saw Hannah Hidalgo take over. She ended with a triple-double. She took over for Notre Dame, whereas under Vanderbilt, a lot of reliance was on Michaela Blakes. Of course, she didn't have the most efficient shooting, but honestly, that's what happens when the whole team is kind of sort of on your back. And Notre Dame ended up winning, and they moved on to the Elite Eight. Now, like I said, this was such a great game. It was a very back-and-forth game. You saw Notre Dame was really battling it out against Vanderbilt, and ultimately, you had the last shot by Hannah Hidalgo that allowed Notre Dame to win. Now, ultimately, I do think with Vanderbilt, one of the problems is that they just really need to continue to build around Michaela Blakes. They need a big in the paint. They need another guard that can help out Michaela, okay? They need a couple of shooters. They just need a couple of players that will be able to build around Michaela, and I think Vanderbilt will be solid. But ultimately, Vanderbilt has such a great season, right? So they should be proud of themselves for being able to go all the way to the Sweet 16. And ultimately, that was a major congrats to Notre Dame, because then they would be moving on to be facing UConn, which I will be talking about later. And then in the Sweet 16 game, we did see UConn face North Carolina, and UConn ended up winning 87-76. We saw strong games from Sarah Strong. We saw a really good game from AZ Fudd. I mean, UConn in that game really did show how and why they are the best team in the country. Okay, so that game should have been a shock to absolutely nobody. And then we saw UCLA take down Minnesota, and they were also moving on to the Elite Eight. We all know that UCLA is the number 2 team in the country, so them beating Minnesota should not be a shock to anybody, honestly. And so now let's actually move on to 2 of the Elite Eight games, because the other 2 actually come on tonight as soon as this episode drops. So we're only going to be talking about the 2 that aired yesterday. So first, let's talk about UConn versus Notre Dame. Now, going into this game, I thought that this was going to be another blowout type of game. I'm not going to lie, because UConn and Notre Dame met in the regular season, and UConn beat Notre Dame by like 40 points. I mean, you saw really big games from Sarah Strong, AZ Fudd, of course, the stars of the team. So the question is whether Notre Dame was going to be able to adapt, really try to limit AZ or Sarah or any of the other players on the team, and whether they were going to be able to really not rely on Hannah as much and really try to get other players to step it up and help her out. And let me tell you something. Notre Dame kept it close against UConn. They were actually battling it out against UConn. Now, UConn did end up winning 70-52, but I don't want you to be deceived by that score, because for the majority of the game, Notre Dame and UConn were actually really, really close. And when I mean really close, I mean like UConn was up by single digits. So it's not as if this was a complete shutout from the beginning, like how it was in the regular season, okay? You did, of course, see big games from Hannah Hidalgo, right? She put up a double-double with 22 points and 11 rebounds. You saw big games from Sarah Strong. You saw big games from AZ Fudd. And ultimately, it just came down to the fact that Notre Dame just fell apart at the very end, right? And that's what allowed UConn to take over and have that large lead and eventually win by that large margin that they ended up winning by. But this is not to say that Notre Dame was not competitive against UConn, because they absolutely were. So that's a major congrats to UConn for advancing to the Final Four. Now, with Notre Dame, the fact that they were able to be competitive against the number one team in the country is indicative of the fact that they need more players on that team. What do I mean by this? So for this season, you saw Notre Dame lose Olivia Miles to the transfer portal. Olivia Miles now is at TCU. You saw Notre Dame lose Sonia Citron because she moved on and she is now in the WNBA. So right now, your main star on that team is Hannah Hidalgo. And Hannah had a great season, okay? But ultimately, it's just her. She is the one that is basically trying to carry this team at 5'6". I know. But it's crazy because she needs a big in the paint. She needs a couple of other shooters on the team. She ultimately needs some help, because the issue is not coaching. I think Ivy is a great coach. Okay, the fact that she was able to take this team and take them all the way to the Elite Eight when I didn't think Notre Dame was even going to make it past the second round, that in and of itself is impressive. So what I am saying here is that this is not a coaching issue. This is a roster issue. They need more players on that roster outside of Hannah Hidalgo. They need more players, whether it is through recruits or through the transfer portal, whatever it may be, they need more players that can help out Hannah. Because I think as long as they get a big in the paint, as long as they get a couple of shooters in the wing, right? As long as you get something like that where Hannah is not the only one that is being reliant on in the paint or when it comes to the offense and obviously defense, right? Then I think Notre Dame would actually be a really good team that could advance to the Final Four, that could advance to the national championship game. But ultimately, I do think it comes down to that roster. It comes down to the talent that they have on the team. So hopefully Notre Dame will be able to pick up some more players, but ultimately, they need to pick up more players if they want to go way beyond the Sweet 16 and the Elite 8. And now the second game that I want to talk about is UCLA versus Duke. Now, let's be honest here. I did not expect Duke to go all the way to the Elite 8. I really didn't. I thought it was going to be Iowa. Okay, and Iowa ended up, losing in an upset game. Okay, whatever, right? But Duke was competitive against UCLA. They were extremely competitive. They were shooting very well, especially in the first half. I don't know what happened in the third and fourth quarter, especially towards the end of the third quarter. From that point on, Duke almost just looked like Duke forgot how to play basketball because they were extremely sloppy. They were rushing their shots. Like, it did not look like the same Duke team that we saw in the first half of the game, in the first two quarters of the game. So I don't know if it was because they got way too comfortable, that they just forgot how to play from the first half. I don't know exactly what happened there, But it was really weird to see because I actually looked and was like, oh my goodness, is Duke going to pull this upset against UCLA? The same UCLA that everyone actually has advancing to the Final Four. So ultimately, I do think Duke was this close, honestly, of winning. Even though UCLA, of course, they're coming out with the win, they're advancing to the Final Four. But let me tell you something. Duke really did put up a fight, at least in the first half of the game, against UCLA. I think ultimately the problem there is just, I think they don't need any more players. Maybe they could use one more shooter. But ultimately, I think that they need to just keep it pushing through the end. That, I think, was the biggest issue. There's nothing when it comes to talent, because they have a lot of talented players, from Toby to Ashlyn to everybody else. It's just a matter of allowing the coach to kind of keep the players in the game, allowing the players to stick with what was working in the first half. As long as you keep that up, I do think they could have beaten UCLA. But it's okay. You know what? I know it's a devastating loss, but I think that it is really impressive for Duke, a team like Duke, to be able to advance all the way to the Elite Eight the way they did. So, like I said, the other two Elite Eight games are tonight as soon as you are watching this episode. So, we're going to have to wait to see what the matchups are for the Final Four. But I think the Final Four is going to be really, really exciting. So now that's all college basketball. Now let's actually move on to the NBA. Now, like I said in the beginning of this video, we are almost at the end of the regular season and the start of the postseason. So one of the big questions that's on everyone's mind is who should actually be MVP? Now, I made a video on TikTok talking about this a while ago, but I'm going to talk about it in more details here. Now, basically, there is the big issue, not necessarily of who is talented enough or who had the best season to get MVP. The question is all about who would actually be eligible to get MVP. And here's why. The NBA has a 65-game rule. And basically what it means is that a player has to play in at least 65 games in the regular season to be eligible to get the awards such as MVP, just as an example, right? So the question is not only who had a great season, but also who has played in more than 65 games for this season to get MVP. Now, it seemed like from a few weeks ago that Cade Cunningham was actually a strong contender for MVP. Now, the Detroit Pistons is one of the best teams in the league right now. They are one of the best teams in the Eastern Conference. So, he is a great contender for MVP. He is having a great season, but ultimately, you can even look at Jaylen Brown. You can look at Luka Doncic. Even though a lot of people don't have Luka as MVP, right, which is a little baffling because he's actually having a great season, but I digress. You can look at Shea. You can look at Joker. You can look at Wemby, right? There are so many players that are having great seasons that the question is, who can actually go and win MVP this season? Now, I do think, though, that Cade is a great contender for MVP because you're talking about a Detroit Pistons team where without Cade, they ultimately do fall apart. As good of a team they are, you understand that Cade is that leader. He is that glue for the team. Almost how it was with Shea last season when you saw OKC go in that run. Still Shea kind of sort of now, but it's in that same vibe. That's how it is with Cade and with the Detroit Pistons, okay? So he is a strong contender, but honestly, I think that Jaylen Brown should also be considered for MVP. I mean, you're talking about a team that made very questionable decisions when it comes to trades, and that's all I'm going to say about that. And then you're also losing your best player, Jason Tatum, because he was out with an Achilles injury. Now, he is, of course, back, but who was honestly keeping that team together while Tatum was out? It was Jaylen Brown. Okay, now Boston maintained to be a top 5 team in the Eastern Conference without Jason Tatum. Again, why? Because of Jaylen Brown. So if people want to look at, for example, Cade, I think people should also be looking at Jaylen Brown, right? Of course, you could look at Nikola Jokic, of course, who is putting up triple-doubles like nothing else. And he's actually on track to beating Russell Westbrook's record for most triple-doubles in a season. So, I mean, you can look at him, but I don't know if a lot of people want to feel like, oh, well, he has won so many many times, or he's been a contender so many times that we don't want to give it to him anymore. I don't really care. If you are an MVP, you are an MVP. Like, whatever. I mean, you could go and you could look at Luka, for example, right? Luka, I think, is having a good season. But even then, even outside of Cade and Jalen, I think someone else that should be looked at is Wemby, right? The San Antonio Spurs just clinched the playoffs, which I'll actually be talking about next. But, right, the San Antonio Spurs, like, their star player is Wemby. Okay, you're talking about the same Wemby where, because he was out last season because of the blood clots issue, you're talking about a team that kind of fell apart without him. So this season, not only is he having a good season, but the Spurs also just clinched the playoffs. When was the last time we heard of the San Antonio Spurs clinching the playoffs? Right? So ultimately, I think it should come down to either Cade, Jalen, or Wemby. Those are the three players that I think that should be contenders for MVP for this season. Right? Me personally, I think it could be more argued for Jalen than Cade and with Wemby, but ultimately all three of those are debatable. So with that, now I want to talk actually about the playoffs. So let's start first with the Eastern Conference. So who has clinched a playoff spot? We got the Detroit Pistons, right, who are the top team in the Eastern Conference, so that should be a shock to nobody. We got the Boston Celtics, who are also a top team in the Eastern Conference. Those are two teams that have clinched playoff spots. That should be a shock to nobody. So those two teams are the teams that actually clinched a playoff spot. You still got a team like the Knicks who do have a chance of making it to the playoffs, but they have right now at least secured a play-in tournament spot. Then you also have teams like the Cavs, where it's still questionable whether they would even be in the play-in tournament in the first place. Right now, they are fourth in the Eastern Conference, so I do think that they could make it to the playoffs. But right now, of course, it is still questionable because the regular season is not over. That's the same thing with the Hawks, same thing with the Sixers, same thing with the Raptors, right? All of those teams, we are still unsure because the regular season is still going on, because we still need to know what the standings are. But ultimately, what we do know is that the Pistons and the Celtics have secured a playoff spot officially, and the Knicks have at least secured a spot at a minimum in the play-in tournament. So now in the Western Conference, it's a little different, right? So, of course, we do have the Oklahoma City Thunder and the San Antonio Spurs that have clinched a playoff spot. That should be a shock to nobody because those are the top two teams in the Western Conference. However, unlike the Eastern Conference, we do have a few teams in the Western Conference that have secured at least a play-in tournament spot. We have the LA Lakers, we have the Minnesota Timberwolves, we have the Houston Rockets, we have the Denver Nuggets, and we have the Phoenix Suns. Now, those should be teams that, of course, nobody should be shocked at, especially with teams such as the Timberwolves and the Lakers because of how good that they have been so far. Now, what's going to be interesting is seeing teams such as the Trailblazers, the Warriors, right, the Clippers, and seeing whether they would be able to clinch at least a play-in tournament spot, because right now they are a little questionable because a couple of losses in the regular season, of course, could bump them out. So that ultimately is going to be up in the air, but it is getting a little bit spicy right now. It is getting a little interesting as to who exactly is going to make it to the playoffs and who's going to make it to the tournament this season. Now, before we wrap up this episode, I want to talk about one last topic, and that is with boxing, because this past weekend we did have a big fight between Sebastian Fundora, aka the Towering Inferno, and Keith Thurman, also known as The One. But before I get into that major fight, I want to actually talk about the fight that happened beforehand, and that was between Jonas Tellez and Brian Mendoza. Now, that was a very close fight in the beginning, in the first couple of rounds. Then in round 3, you saw Mendoza accidentally headbutt Tellez, and ultimately Tellez dropped down in pain. You saw a lot of blood just dripping down onto the ring floor, and ultimately there was the big question of, oh my goodness, did Tellez go and break his nose? Which, fast forward, yes, he did. But ultimately, the ref had to go to the corner and say, hey, do you want this fight to continue, right? His corner said yes, Tellez said yes, right? And they continued on the fight. And honestly, I was a little shocked about that. And the reason why was because I actually thought that they were just going to stop the fight. I thought they were just going to say, hey, we cannot continue on with this fight because of the fact that Tellez went and broke his nose. But they did not do that. They continued on with this fight, and Tellez ended up winning by unanimous decision. Now, he did speak at the end. He did say, I did probably break my nose and I didn't say anything, but ultimately it was very hard to breathe. So the fact that he was going through a broken nose, it was hard for him to breathe and everything else like that, and he still managed to go and win that fight by unanimous decision. Dog. That is a absolute dog. And that was such an entertaining fight. So congratulations to Tayez for winning that fight under those circumstances, because that is truly impressive. And then now I want to talk about Fundora versus Thurman. Now, Fundora is, of course, one of those fighters that's really trying to make a name for himself. He currently holds 2 belts. Now, of course, you have Thurman, who has not been in the ring in years. And this is supposed to be his quote-unquote tune-up fight. So, for context, Fundora is like 6'6", and Thurman is like 5'7", 5'8". So you're talking about almost an 8-inch difference between the two fighters. And of course, with Fundora having a way longer reach than Thurman does. So ultimately, you would be thinking, okay, well, if Thurman wants to go and fight Fundora, which first of all, I think that was a bad idea, but like I'll talk about that later. Then ultimately, the question is he going to be attacking the body? Like, what exactly is his game plan? And now we get into the fight, and honestly, I still couldn't tell you what Thurman's game plan was, because that opening hit in the first round by Fundora, I just kind of looked and I said, oh my goodness, this is not going to be a pretty fight at all. Now, Fundora was very reserved. He had his control. He was very efficient. And ultimately, actually, these were actually the least amount of punches thrown in the first 3 rounds by Fundora, basically like ever in his career. So it was really interesting that he was almost like holding back. You know, he was trying to really focus on his defense, really waiting for the time to go and punch. And ultimately, you did hear at the end of the 4th round, you heard his corner say, Fundora, you have to let your hands go. You have to let your hands go and basically just start swinging. And what did you see in the 5th round? Fundora throw combinations after combinations after combination. I mean, catching Thurman in the face, catching him in the body. Thurman at this point is just not playing defense at all. Okay, like he does not have his hands up. I mean, nothing. And so at the end of the 5th round, Thurman's face was so messed up. I mean, I thought they were going to stop the fight because it was just not looking pretty. Now, obviously, Thurman's corner did not say, hey, stop the fight, nothing else like that. So they moved on to the 6th round. And Fundora continued on with, punch after punch, after combination, after jabs, after hooks, after, uppercuts, everything. He's been giving Thurman literally everything, to the point that the ref had to go and stop the fight because Thurman was just not putting his hands up at all. Now, Thurman was ultimately really upset with the ref, saying, hey, why did you go and you stop the fight? And the ref kind of looking at him like, dude, you're catching punches with your face. Like, ultimately, that's what it was. Thurman was catching these punches with his face. He did not even attempt to put his hands up. He did not even attempt to dodge the punches. I mean, it was like every punch that Fundora was throwing, Thurman was over here catching them with his face. Ultimately, you gotta stop the fight at that point. Like I said, I thought they were going to stop it at the end of the 5th round because his face was that messed up. But they continued on, and eventually the ref just kind of said, yeah, I had enough. Now, of course, to no shock at all, Fundora ended up winning by technical knockout. And I honestly think this is one of, if not the worst loss in Thurman's career. Now, I said beforehand that Thurman fighting Fundora was not a good idea. And I still believe that it was not a good idea. And the reason why is because Fundora is the best fighter in that division, period. Okay? So, as Thurman, as somebody who is not only 37 years old, but you are talking about someone that has not stepped into the ring in years, your first thought was, okay, not only am I going to step into this ring, but I am also going to fight the best fighter in this division? Like, what kind of thinking is that? I would say at least, if you want to go and try to make this sort of comeback, then at least fight one of the smaller guys. And I say smaller in the sense of smaller in names and in size, things like that. Why would you want to fight a dude that's 6'6" that got power in his punches? Why would you want to go and do that? Again, as a man who has not stepped into the ring in years. Why do you want that to be your first fight? So I just don't understand what the thinking was, first of all, in even taking that fight. But then also, too, on top of that, the strategy wasn't even working because you got caught in the face so many times. I mean, ultimately, the strategy here should have been, go and attack the body. There's no way I'm going to be able to reach him. So let's just attack the body, hope he crouches down, and then that's when I can catch him in the jaw. You would think that's what he would do. But no, he maintained the distance. That's actually more beneficial for Fundora. And he was literally jumping up to try to go punch him in the jaw. Who thinks like that? Whose idea was this at the table? Whose idea was that? Because that has to be the worst idea I think I have seen. I thought Teofimo's fight against Shakur, I thought he had a bad strategy going in, but this one takes the cake. Thurman's strategy going into this fight is probably the worst strategy I think I have seen in a while. Because, again, if you're fighting somebody that's 8 inches taller than you, right, that got reach and everything, why don't you want to step into the inside? Why don't you want to step into his space? Why don't you want to go and really focus on attacking the body? Like, why don't you want to do that and instead try to literally jump up and lunge to try to hit him in the face when you know Fundora can also dodge that and then counter, because right now you are wide open because of that attempted punch that you want to do to the jaw. Like, it did not make any sense at all. And ultimately, I think after this, I don't see Thurman fighting for another couple of years, honestly, if he wanted to. Or maybe after this fight, he's going to retire. Who knows? But ultimately, congratulations to Fundora for taking down Keith Thurman. And ultimately, Thurman, I think that was probably the worst idea all around I think I have seen from you. Like, that was just not good. But that is all for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next week, we will be talking about hockey. Next week, we will be talking more NBA stuff. We'll be talking about college basketball and all of the works. So, see you next week. Bye.